All right, we're going to look at absolutism as it exists in France during the 1600s, and we're looking at kind of this transition from Henry IV to Louis XIII to Louis XIV to understand how and why it is that France shifts away from what I'll call a traditional monarchy, where the king, although holds some powers, definitely is has to defer to the nobility, to a country where the king exercises almost total and complete power over everybody. So we're going to kind of take a look at that and see how that plays out. So first, we'll start with what Henry IV does. So Henry IV, after winning the War of Three Henries, that civil war, begins his efforts to consolidate the power of the French monarchy. And we recall that he converts to Catholicism and issues the Edict of Nantes, which is an edict that grants religious tolerance to Calvinists, as well as some minor political freedom to 150 different walled cities within France. And so that is done in order to kind of appease the population and kind of bring everyone together after this relatively destructive civil war, the War of the Three Henries. Henry IV appoints a guy, a Duke of Sully, to be his chief minister. And so Sully, that's kind of how we refer to him, Sully works as chief minister in order to help kind of right the ship of France at this time. It's kind of chaotic. There's high taxes, and so there's not a lot of economic growth. So as chief minister, Sully lowers taxes on the peasants. He really lowers taxes kind of across the board. And his thought is that if he can lower these taxes, he can create trade, and then this trade will create other revenue which will offset the decrease in taxes. So he eliminates some of the kind of the chaos of the internal structure of taxes within France. So within France, if you try to move goods from one side of the country to the other, everywhere along the way where you moved into a different nobleman's territory, you would have to pay taxes to him, and that nobleman would collect however many taxes he wanted. It was not centralized in the slightest. And so Sully realizes that this isn't really going to work on top of that. So he centralizes taxes, so he says basically the taxes have to go to the king, not just the nobleman's will, and then reduces them. And a way to offset these costs is this loss of revenue is to create something called the paulette, which is it's a fee that's paid annually by royal officials so that they can keep their power. And this keeps their office in their family. It makes it hereditary, but it also generates revenue for the French king. Like, if you want to be this duke every year, you're going to have to pay me money this year. If you want to be the tax collector in this area, you're going to have to pay me a fee. If you want to be in charge of the judiciary in this area, you'll have to pay me a fee. So it's a way for the king to really create revenue without increasing taxes necessarily. He's just selling off offices, which is a problem in its own right, but for now it kind of works. In addition to all of this, Henry and Sully are able to restore public order and some public trust after the chaos that had been the War of the Three Henries. They're able to kind of stabilize the economy, stabilize the government, and kind of usher in a brief era of peace. And so this comes crashing down when Henry is murdered by a kind of a crazed Catholic priest who doesn't really believe that Henry is true to his Catholic faith. He doesn't agree with the Edict of Nantes that grants religious freedom. He is really frustrated, so he hops in and kills Henry. And when he kills Henry, or the monarchy is passed down to Henry's son, Louis XIII. And so we get to Louis XIII. Louis XIII becomes king at the age of 9. And he rules. So when he's 9, he's obviously not able to rule. He needs someone to rule in his stead. And so his mother, Maria de Medici, rules for him, but she recognizes that as queen and a foreigner, she doesn't really have a whole lot of authority. And so she turns to Cardinal Richelieu to rule for him as chief minister. And so Cardinal Richelieu really comes to dominate the reign of Louis XIII, and we'll get to him in a minute. But Louis XIII spends his life being told what to do by other people, first by his mother and then by Richelieu. And so he is very kind of weak. He's not really a great leader. He's just kind of a mama's boy in many ways, and also controlled by others. He gets married off to Anne of Austria at the age of 14, so trying to create some sort of bond between France and Austria. And again, this just goes back to all the intermarriage that's happening within Europe, just wrecking their nobility. And Louis XIII really he's more interested in hunting and sport and enjoying life than he is in actually governing. And so he builds Palace of Versailles initially as a kind of a hunting retreat for himself, but he turns over the task of governing to his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, who we're going to look at now, who is a fascinating and super important character throughout history. So, Cardinal Richelieu essentially runs the government for Louis XIII. He is the speaker piece. He is the main guy. He makes all the policies. He runs the government. His whole goal, his entire goal as chief minister, is to strengthen the power of the king. He wants to centralize the monarchy. He wants to centralize the government. And in addition to that, he wants to centralize culture. And so one of the neat things that Richelieu does is he founds what's called the French Academy. It's a gathering spot of the intellectuals in the French, and they can get together and kind of advance French culture. And one of the first things they do is create a dictionary. And it's one of the first dictionaries put together. It is kind of highlights the French language and makes it more useful. So Cardinal Richelieu starts off, again, his whole goal is consolidate power for the monarchy. So one of the ways that Cardinal Richelieu is able to so effectively strengthen the monarchy is to weaken the nobility, right? So when you try to add power to the king, you have to take power from someone, and that someone that they take power from is the nobles. And so one of the ways in which he does this that kind of best exemplifies this is the division of France into 32 different districts, and then appointing different intendants to run each of those districts. And intendants are essentially liaisons from the king, people who are there from the king to rule in his stead. So, in general, the people that Richelieu appoints as his intendants are new nobility, and they're called nobles of the robe. They've been recently appointed to the rank of nobility. They owe their allegiance to Richelieu and Louis XIII. They don't have family ties going way back. And so this is important because then their loyalty is not to some other family that may feel like they deserve to be the royal family in France, but rather their loyalty is to the king, who has given them this opportunity for power and wealth. And these intendants were never from the district that they were put in charge of. So he would take people from the southwest of France and make them run the northeast of France. And the reason he would do this is because that takes them away from their power base. It takes them away from people they knew. It took them away from old connections. It essentially took them away from the opportunity to plot to overthrow the king. Because if he had left them to be in charge of the district that they were originally from, that they were the nobility from, then they would have people there who owed them loyalty. They would have family members there, extended family. They would have private armies there. And they could kind of create chaos. But by moving them somewhere else, they have to establish a whole new set of connections. And they're unable to do that because this new group doesn't necessarily trust them. They don't want them there. All these sorts of things. So instead of fostering any resentment, what this does is it fosters a sense of loyalty to the new king. And their job there is really just to act as an arm of the king. They're not to act as independent people. They're to collect taxes, administer laws, and then monitor the local nobility. So they basically send reports to Paris that say, hey, this is what's going on in my district, whether there's talk of an uprising, whether there's a grain shortage, whether there's economic growth, whether there's a local nobleman who's not following the laws, whatever it may be. They send that information to Paris, and then they receive reports from Paris that say, hey, these are the new laws, or this is what I want you to do. And they just enact those. They enforce those royal orders. And so by creating this division of France into all these different districts, and by using this intendant system, what Louis does, and what Cardinal Richelieu does, under the rule of Louis, is Richelieu weakens the power of the regional nobility. All the power is taken away from them. You don't get to make decisions anymore. In Paris, we make the decisions, we send the information to you, and you enforce the decisions. And so there's this shift in power away from nobility and towards the king. Richelieu also works to, as part of his effort to centralize power, he decides that he needs to get after this Edict of Nantes. Because what it did is it created these kind of essentially self-governing, quasi-independent political entities of Calvinist Huguenot cities. And so he looked at the Edict of Nantes and said, okay, here's the deal. We need to end this political and military rights that the Huguenots have. They can't make their own laws, because what was happening is in these 150 towns where Huguenots could worship freely, they weren't allowing Catholics to worship freely. And so to Cardinal Richelieu, who was a cardinal in the Catholic Church, this doesn't sit right. How is it possible that I'm going to grant you religious freedom, but you're not going to grant me religious freedom? That doesn't work. And it's undermining the political authority of the king. And so he says this isn't going to happen. So he eliminates their political and military rights, but allows them religious tolerance. So he says, you cannot have these independent cities or city-states within the whole of France. That doesn't work. You have to abide by the same laws that everyone else does. But I'll still allow you to be Calvinist. Okay, I'll still allow you to practice your religion. And he does this because he believed the Edict of Nantes was intended to be temporary, and it truly was. It was never meant to be a forever thing. Religious tolerance wasn't a 17th century ideal. It's barely an ideal right now in 2016. But it was intended to be a temporary measure. So the goal was to end Protestant independence, and he's successful at that. And some places resent that and don't want to go along with that. One of those, the famous city, is La Rochelle. They refuse to tear down their walls and give up their political independence. So Cardinal Richelieu attacks them, very quickly demolishes the city, completely destroys it, and then, just to rub salt in the wound, celebrates the Catholic Mass in the middle of that destroyed city. So that's what we've got going on there. And by doing this, he's able to weaken the influence of the nobility who were Calvinist. They no longer had this independence that they thought they had. That is really very much taken away from them. In terms of his foreign policy, Richelieu is very much concerned with the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs have been divided into two separate branches: the Austrian Habsburgs, which control, at this point, the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Spanish Habsburgs, which control Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, and the New World holdings. And so they essentially have France surrounded. So Richelieu recognizes that this is a real problem, and so he does everything he can in order to support the enemies of the Habsburgs. This includes working with the Swedish during the 30 Years' War, if you recall that. And as a result of that, he acquires part of a French territory known as Alsace, which shows up a few more times throughout our study of history. In order to do this, though, Richelieu comes up very famously with his own raison d'etat, which is a reason of state. And basically what Richelieu says is that in matters that affect the state, in interests of the state, God would forgive an action that would otherwise be sinful if an individual person committed it. So, in this example of this 30 Years' War working with the Swedish were Protestant. And they were fighting the Catholic Holy Roman Empire. And so, in your individual life, it would be sinful, according to Richelieu, to support a Protestant over a Catholic. But in the interests of the French state, God understands that this isn't a sin, that this is acceptable behavior to support a Protestant over a Catholic. And so this is a way that that Richelieu is able to justify his foreign policies, is by saying, no, God gets it. I'm working for the good of France, and God understands this. And so he's able to kind of make amends with his own personal religious belief, despite his religious affiliation. So Cardinal Richelieu dies. And Cardinal Richelieu is just such a central and important figure. And he is kind of holding France together at this point. And he dies, and he is replaced by another cardinal in the Catholic Church, Mazarin. And Cardinal Mazarin follows and is the chief minister to Louis XIII for about a year. And then Louis XIII dies. Dies relatively young. And he dies when his son, Louis XIV, is only 5 years old. And so Cardinal Mazarin tries to continue Richelieu's policies. He becomes the regent, that is the person who rules in the place of Louis XIV until Louis XIV is going to be old enough to govern. And he's certainly not the statesman that Richelieu was. He's not quite as effective a ruler as Richelieu. But he does his best, and he is able to successfully put down this mini revolt and civil war known as the Fronde. And what happens in this is that the Fronde is this time where shortly after Louis XIII has died, the nobles recognize that there's kind of a power vacuum. Richelieu, who was the strong one holding them together, is dead. Louis XIII is dead. The king is a 5-year-old boy. And this is an opportunity to strike, to take back some of the power that had been taken from them. And so this Fronde, this brutal civil war breaks out. And it's very bloody and violent, but eventually the nobles are suppressed and put down. But the Fronde is really important because although Mazarin survives it, it's important in that it affects Louis XIV greatly. So we're going to get to Louis XIV now, because Louis XIV sees as a young child what has happened because of the perceived weakness of the monarchy. So Louis XIV, in his mind, decides, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to make sure that no matter what I do, I never let the nobles see weakness. I never let the nobles have an opportunity to rise up against me. And so Louis XIV's main goal his whole time as king is to take complete control from the nobility. That is his goal. And so in order to do that, he does a number of things. First, he recognizes that he's not quite strong enough yet to just force them to do his will. What he has to do is earn their cooperation. And so he works with them on various projects like canals and roads and things. And he gets buy-in from them. Says, hey, if you help me with this, it will kind of glorify your region because you will have these canals. You'll be able to earn more money from trade coming through them. It'll be great. Why don't you help me out? But in doing so, he's tricking the nobles into thinking they're benefiting themselves when really they're benefiting Louis. Because now Louis XIV has a entire canal and road system stretching throughout his whole empire, his whole country. And so if any of the noblemen decide that they want to rebel, well, he can very quickly use the canals and the roads that those noblemen had just built to get an army there quickly to put them down. This also increases trade across the country and speed of movement because things are just able to be transported faster when they are on roads and canals and a whole network rather than the way they had been before. So that's an important way that he gains the cooperation of the nobles. Another way he works to kind of suppress the nobles is through making them live at the Palace of Versailles for part of a year. And the idea behind it is this: is he forces this whole the whole nobleman's family to come live at Versailles. That way, if they're off working as an attendant in a district and decide to cause trouble, Well, now he has hostages. He has the nobleman's wife and children as hostages. But it also allows him to keep an eye on them to prevent them from plotting against him, because they're not going to plot against him while they're living at his estate. He has all these servants and things that are on his paid staff that will report to him if there's any kind of subversive activity, and he can kind of squash that. In addition, Versailles at this point, he had really, really elaborately decorated. It was super extravagant, super wealthy, and showed off not only his wealth, but also his power. It was designed to be intimidating to the people who were there, and it very much was. They recognized that their power was so limited compared to Louis. So we have that going on. And then what he does is he really is able to read people well, and recognizes that this old nobility is in this for pride. And so his manipulation of the nobility is designed to let the nobles keep their pride while taking real power away from them. So he allows them to maintain their titles, he allows them to maintain the old privileges that they wanted, but he is selecting counselors from the new nobility. His advisors are from the new nobility. The people who really are able to move things and change things are from the new nobility, not from the old nobility. And so, yes, you're still a nobleman, but no, you no longer have any power. And one of the other ways he does that is he never calls a meeting of the Estates General, which is a collection of all the noblemen, representatives from the church and from the third estate, the lower classes. He never does that, so he never gives them an opportunity to cry out against him. Louis XIV also uses a secret police. He never has, after Mazarin, he never has another first minister, and he creates a government that's highly structured and bureaucratic. So it's kind of everything flows from him, but everything also reports back directly to him. So that's how he takes kind of control of the nobility. One of the big problems for Louis is that he's never really able to get his finances really, really well under control. Part of the reason is that he's just spending money left and right. Like, he can just have this infinite supply of money. So he has this massive bureaucracy. He's holding his court at Versailles, these fancy feasts. He's got to decorate with all this art and gold and chandeliers and silver. And all really expensive. Plus, he reforms the military, creates this massive military, large upkeep costs. And then he goes to war all the time. And war is tremendously expensive. And so he loses lots of money. On top of this, the taxation system in France was very broken. In order to set a tax in a particular region, it required that that region's estates, which were essentially their Senate, Parliament, whatever you want to call it, their legislative body, would have to vote to approve that tax on that particular region. Now, if you were from that region, and the king came to you and said, hey, we want to raise taxes on your region, you are going to vote no every single time. So it's very difficult to raise the taxes and raise revenue. In addition, the taxes are generally put on the peasants, who are the people who are making the least amount of money. So the people who are the wealthiest, the nobility and the clergy, are not really paying anything, while the people who have the least, the peasants, are paying huge percentages of it. And so this is problematic and kind of leads to some collapses. On top of that, another problem, again, there's just never-ending financial problems. And this, although Louis tries to fix it, this rears its ugly head again in the late 1700s with the French Revolution. But the method of collecting taxes was inefficient. What would happen is the government would sell tax contracts. So if you wanted to collect taxes in a certain region, you would bid on that. Say like, oh, I'll give you $500,000 to collect taxes in this city or this region. And they would say, great, pay up, go get us that, and then go get the taxes. And so the government would say, from that region, we expect you to collect $200,000 in taxes. So now this tax farmer owes $200,000 in taxes plus $500,000 for the commission, but anything he makes on top of that, he gets to keep. So these tax farmers would necessarily go and tax at a much higher rate than necessary, because by doing that, they're guaranteeing themselves money. And so they want to make money. And so they're taxing these people who can't afford it. They're shaking them down and stealing as much as they possibly can from them. And this is just not a good system, especially because the nobles are generally the ones who are not paying taxes. The middle class writes all these exemptions from taxes. And so the taxes, as I mentioned before, are almost exclusively paid by the peasant classes, which just does not work very well. It's not an effective system. It's not a sustainable system. It's just not going to work out for anybody. And so in order to fix this, Louis really relies heavily on his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, to help reform the finances. And Colbert believed that the purpose of wealth and the purpose of the economy was to serve the country. So he wanted to do everything he can to grow the economy, because if he grew the economy, then that meant that the country was stronger. So the wealthier the country, the stronger it was the thought process by Colbert and really almost everybody, because that just makes sense. And Colbert is a real big proponent of an economic theory known as mercantilism. And mercantilism as an economic theory is kind of multifaceted, but the idea is that the government should regulate the economy in order to make the economy work for the government. And another component to that is then that the government should do everything it can to create an economy in their country that's entirely self-sustaining. So in France, Colbert's goal was to create a French economy that relied on zero imports. That is, everything that the French needed, they would be able to produce in their country or in their colonies. And this stemmed from part of mercantilist theory, which suggested that there was a finite amount of resources in the world, and that, well, which is true, but economically there were a finite amount of resources, which is not necessarily true. And the country should do everything that it could to get as much of them as possible. So your goal should be to create a country that was completely self-sustaining, and then anything that you made that was in excess you could sell off to bring in more of those finite resources to your country. So again, the goal of this mercantilist Colbert theory is to sell more goods abroad than it bought. So we want to produce things and sell them to other countries rather than needing to buy things from other countries, because that would be problematic. To do this, Colbert really supports industry, so he subsidized various industries, specifically the cloth industry, and by subsidizing that means that he's giving them tax breaks, giving them money to start off, or loans, or no interest loans, things like that. He's basically helping them out, or paying them part of the cost of producing certain things in order to offset the cost of that to the consumer. He also encourages craftsmen to come to France. He would offer them resettlement bonuses, opportunities to start new shops, less regulations, things like that. But he really wants people who are skilled in various trades to come to France, because if France doesn't have anyone skilled in those trades, then they would have to import those goods. But if they got people in their countries that were skilled in those trades, they would have to do less importing, which is, again, the whole goal of Colbert's mercantilist theory. Colbert also works to build even more canals and roads, because by doing this, he's connecting France. It increases trade, and it decreases the time that it takes to get goods across the country. So you create a larger national market and a larger national network. He ends internal tariffs, that is that different regions are no longer taxing goods that are passing through them, but increases foreign tariffs. So if you wanted to buy something that was made in Britain, you would have to pay like a 75% tax on it. But if you wanted to buy the same thing that was made on the opposite side of France, you no longer had to pay any taxes on it, because those internal tariffs were ended. And that's a real shift, because before, again, those goods as they transported across France would get taxed all along the way. Colbert ends that. He also builds a large merchant marine or navy, to protect French goods and trade, specifically with their holdings in the New World, in Canada, in Newfoundland and Quebec and those sorts of areas that were rich in natural resources. He also pushed for efforts to tap into the resources of Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory, which is kind of the entirety of the modern Mississippi Delta, which had lots and lots of natural resources that Colbert wanted to tap into, which would help make France self-sustaining as a nation, at least as an economic nation. So that's Colbert. He is an incredibly influential finance minister, and by doing all of this, he's trying to restructure the French economy and the French revenue source so that the king is on more stable ground. Louis XIV kind of ends religious tolerance. So he officially revokes the Edict of Nantes in October of 1648, which ends that religious tolerance for Huguenots, the French Catholics. So Richelieu had ended the political independence of them, and now Louis XIV ends the religious independence of them. And the reason he does this, kind of two reasons why he does this. Again, as I mentioned before, religious tolerance was not intended to be long-term, and Louis XIV recognized to create a singular nation under him, a singular king, he wanted to make everyone the same religion. Louis had a famous saying. He said, "I am the state," and everything essentially then that he said or did is what went, and he was really pushing for everyone to be like him, to embrace his theories, to embrace his thoughts, to embrace his attitudes, because that was the way things were supposed to be. Another reason he revoked it is because religious tolerance wasn't popular. The people in his country didn't want these Protestants around. They wanted them gone. Sometimes they wanted them gone because they were really devout Catholics. Sometimes they wanted them gone because they saw economic opportunities if their neighbors were out of the way. But nonetheless, they wanted them gone. So he ended that. He really cracked down. The problem is this had really, really negative consequences that were kind of unforeseen by Louis. First, he loses a lot of his skilled craftsmen who were Protestant, and they just simply go over to the Netherlands or to northern Germany or across the ocean to Great Britain, or even immigrate to new colonies that were being set up both in Africa and in the Americas. So this kind of backfires on him. Okay? And then it also angers the other European Protestant nations, places like the Netherlands, who had kind of practiced kind of religious tolerance, Denmark, England. Those sorts of places start to get really frustrated with Louis and his intolerance towards their kind. And then Louis is also very well known for just fighting wars all the time. Almost the entirety of his time that he's ruling, or for a vast majority of it, Louis is at war with other nations. And this is expensive. It leads to his economic troubles, but it also kind of helps him consolidate his power. By focusing on an enemy other, it prevents internal dispute. So if you want to kind of consolidate power, you point to an external threat or enemy, and people tend to rally behind you. Louis also does a good job of modernizing and creating a centralized army that is under the rule of the king and the French government, the central government, instead of the nobles. So if you'll recall, the way this used to work is when the king wanted to go to war, he would have to ask his nobles to raise their private armies and then convince them to go to war with him. And so now, instead of that, Louis just says, we're going to war, get the French army together, instead of the armies of the various dukes and barons and those sorts of things. Instead, now it's the French army. And so in these series of wars, he acquires parts of Flanders, which is a really productive economic area in the Netherlands, or what would have then been the Spanish Netherlands. Building off this success and the weakness of the Holy Roman Empire, he seizes Lorraine for France. And again, like Alsace, that's a region in France that will come up time and time again, so just be aware of that. And although he gains these important economic areas, these wars are super expensive, and they cripple the French finances. And the one that is kind of the coup de grace, the last kind of straw, the final defeat that ends French expansion, is the War of Spanish Succession. And so to understand this, why this war happens, you kind of have to understand the complex intermarriage of nobility at this time. The King of Spain was Charles II. And Charles II had multiple siblings, multiple sisters. And one of the sisters was married to Louis XIV. And the other was married to the King of Austria, that lineage. And so Charles II of Spain was an idiot. He was an imbecile. He was useless. He kind of was no good for anything. And so that's the kind of foundation where we're at with this. And so recognizing that Charles was an idiot, and Charles, by the way, had no children, so he had no one to pass it on to. Louis and the King of Austria had agreed, okay, this is what's going to happen, is when Charles dies, we're going to split up the lands of Spain. And they were going to split up the lands of Spain, including the Spanish Netherlands, the New World, Spain itself, in kind of a way that everyone agreed upon that would keep kind of this balance of power and no one would gain too much power. And they were both able to do this because they were the brothers-in-law of Charles II, so in some way they have kind of claimed to do this. But this falls apart because when Charles II dies, his will is released, and in his will, he gives all of his land to Philip of Anjou, who is Louis XIV's grandson. So, in theory, Philip of Anjou is in line for the French throne. And so Louis sees this opportunity and says, screw the arrangement I made before. I have a chance to get my grandson the throne of Spain. And he's like, but he'll only take Spain. He wouldn't take France as well, which is just a bold-faced lie. And so the Dutch, English, Austrians, Prussians refuse to accept this. They say, no, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to even present this opportunity where it's possible that the crowns of France and Spain could unite into one. Because that would throw off the balance of power. That would just be problematic for everybody. So they formed something called the Grand Alliance. And those four nations go to war against Louis XIV. I should also point out at this point we're talking Austrians and Prussians instead of Holy Roman Empire, because the Holy Roman Empire as an entity essentially ceases to exist after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Okay. So the Grand Alliance fights against France during this War of Spanish Succession, and it ends with what's known as the Peace of Utrecht, which is really, really important in terms of kind of this pivot moment of European history. And the Peace of Utrecht puts Philip of Anjou on the throne of Spain. But it also creates language and laws that prevent the unification of France and Spain from ever happening. Ever. As part of this treaty, France gives up most of their North American territory, essentially all of Canada, which Colbert had worked so hard to exploit. It marks the end of French expansion. They at this point recognize that they've been defeated. They are unable to continue fighting these continental wars in Europe, and they are unable to acquire any more colonies. It marks the end of Spain as any sort of dominant power. They are just done at this point, and we'll talk about why in a second. And it catapults England to be this rank as the most powerful empire in the world, because they acquire that Canadian territory from France. And they proved their dominance. It weakens their two main challengers of France and Spain. And so now they don't really have anybody competing with them in colonies or out in the open ocean. It also gives Austria something. It gives Austria the Spanish Netherlands, which is kind of this weird fit because everyone figured, or it seemed like the Dutch should get the Netherlands as kind of this reunification of the Netherlands. But instead of that, it goes to Austria. So we've got that with the Peace of Utrecht. So that kind of sums up Louis XIV, okay? Here's a man who works super hard to consolidate his power. He takes power away from the nobles. He restructures the economy and the tax system in order to try to right the finances of France and to pay for all these massive wars that he's fighting. But these wars and these taxations also serve to weaken the power of the nobility. Everything that Louis is doing is designed to give him power. And that's really important to know as we go forward. And then the last thing we'll just briefly talk about is why Spain falls apart. They had built their monarchy from their absolute monarchy from expansion. They had a large bureaucracy, a standing army, national taxes, again mostly taxing the poor. But Spain had been taking in too much gold and silver from the New World, devaluing their currency. They had lost most of their middle class when they kicked out the Jews and Muslims, so they were not economically productive. In the middle of all of this, we have the income from the Americas starting to dry up because Spain's losing some of their colonies. They've kind of reached most of the gold and silver that they can easily mine. Other nations are starting to claim it, these sorts of things. And then their tiny middle class problem is made worse because people in Spain believe that money making was beneath them. And so instead of trying to go into economically advantageous professions, they become monks and nuns and priests and do jobs that aren't bad necessarily, but they're not contributing to the overall national economy. In addition, inbreeding in the royal family creates people who are just spineless morons, starting really with Philip II, then Philip III, then Charles II, who's the last meaningful king of Spain. And so the royal family is just a complete nightmare going on there. And so what we see is that Spain and their nationalism is also rooted in their Roman Catholic faith. And so they're never able to move forward and accept new ideas, new economic ideas, new ideas about governing, new ideas about science, because they believe that all of those new ideas come from heretics, from non-Catholics. And so they refuse to accept them. And because of that, they're just left in the dust. They're stuck in the past. And because of that, it leads to complete collapse. So you have this kind of two different tales. One of France, where they really look forward and try new ideas to consolidate power. The other is Spain, who tries to maintain the status quo and find themselves failing miserably.